All right, I think we're live. Guys, thank you very much for joining us today. For anybody who is an Indian viewer of the show, I understand it's an odd hour for you, but well, that's what you get with the 10 and a half hour time difference. So, we do what we can. But I still do appreciate anybody who's here in the live chat joining us and watching us live, and anybody who's going to be watching us later as well. We've got a fun episode for you. We're going to be discussing American politics from an Indian American lens. And to help me do that, I have two great Indian Americans that I can talk to today. So I'm joined by two co-founders of the Hindu American Foundation, Aseem and Suhag Shukla. Guys, welcome.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, tons to get into, but let's talk a little bit about. Let's start with Joe Biden, because he's been the toast of the town for the past couple of weeks. Based off of his performance, which I feel like a lot of people did not see coming. A lot of people did see when a lot of Democratic candidates started dropping off and supporting Joe Biden. People thought he might do well, but he did really, really well in Super Tuesday, didn't he, Suhag?
He did. We saw states that I think were expected to go his way.
Yeah.
And I, at least first let me just put out that Hindu American Foundation is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. So a lot of times, on Twitter and things like that, people are like, well, why isn't HF endorsing someone? Well, we just can't by law. So whatever we're talking about
Right.
is in our individual capacity. Sorry, I had to lawyer up
Exactly.
everyone because I am a lawyer.
That's
but
fair.
I do think as
Oh, should I tell her video?
Oh, did she freeze up a little? Oh,
Yeah.
I think she might be.
Yeah. All right.
Can you?
Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe you want to change location?
Let me do that.
Okay.
Go ahead and talk to Aseem. I will be right back.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll see you soon. Well, Aseem, let me ask you the same question then.
Yeah. Well, Sham, it was an interesting Super Tuesday. I don't think any of us saw it coming. Sanders did okay with Buttigieg in Iowa. They sort of tied.
Yeah.
Again, tied very closely. It's barely won in New Hampshire. Won big in Nevada, and the whole narrative had changed that it's Sanders all the way.
Yeah.
But, people like me who've seen enough elections, over the years, it didn't seem likely that a left-wing candidate was really going to go all the way. And I think at that point, everyone sort of took it like it's just sort of people were surprised, sudden dash. And after that, I think, you saw a coalescing of different candidates behind Biden, as you saw, of course, after Nevada, Klobuchar and Buttigieg left the race. They quickly endorsed, and people think it's some sort of big conspiracy that, they wanted to get the left-wing candidate out of there.
Yeah.
And I don't quite buy into things like that. I think, there was a lot of pressure, certainly, that, look, we have a center lane candidate. In the end, ours is still a centrist sort of country.
Right.
And people coalesced quickly around that. And the African-American community, as is very well known, they're not going to take a chance. To them, Trump was an existential problem. We can talk about it, but to them, he's an existential problem. And they weren't going to risk it on the socialist rhetoric of a Bernie, at least in my opinion.
Right.
And that's why we saw what we saw.
Yeah, it is interesting. So let's maybe talk about Bernie Sanders a little bit in the beginning, since it looks to be Joe Biden versus Trump going forward, unless something miraculous happens. But so talking about Bernie, his campaign was very interesting because he talked about how he would be able to increase turnout. He talked about all these revolutionary ideas in his own words, and a lot of those ideas are not fundamentally terrible ideas, but it's just that a lot of those ideas were being espoused by someone who who presents himself as a communist, who presents himself as someone who appreciates what the USSR was able to achieve, as presents himself as someone who appreciates what Cuba under Fidel Castro was able to achieve, and so this was this wasn't a guy that was in the closet in any way. It's just that because the focus in 2016 was so much on Hillary Clinton, that nobody really got around to asking Bernie Sanders questions about himself and like his positions. He was always this this angry old man screaming at the sky and screaming at the young kids. So everybody just thought, oh, that's nice old Bernie, just angry at everybody all the time, and he had that image about him. But then in 2020, you see for like a week or so, this guy became the front runner. And then everybody started digging into Bernie Sanders, and everybody was like, oh, hang on a minute. This isn't just some, jovial old man down the street. There's something off about this guy. So do you feel like when he became the front runner is when the wheels started to come off a little?
Suhag, do you want to weigh in since I've...
Yeah, go on, Suhag.
Sorry.
And then I'll always... she's freezing again.
Always, maybe a record number of people, I think, working from home and all sorts of things. So we're having been
yeah,
together.
Yeah, that's true.
If you freeze again, just come up here and we'll just share the video. Because
okay, that sounds good.
There we go. We'll just edit out the violence. So
yeah, you just close again.
Because you and I don't always agree on things, but I will say on this, for especially for I think first generation Indian Americans, people like Aseem's parents or my parents who lived in India under a socialist democracy, I think these words were a real turnoff or a put off because we know what the end result is of a very large government that's trying to control all things, and then enter into the picture the possibility of corruption. And this is something we've seen in socialist countries throughout the world, that there are weaknesses that have played over and over throughout history in terms of what it opens up for a certain class of people to be able to do well, and the rest kind of wait in line. So that definitely was a wake-up call.
Right. Yeah.
To your point, Sham, what you said is very true. That until then, we always have an uncle who says, "Hey, Soviet Union, look what they've done for healthcare. Look what Cuba has done for healthcare.
Right.
What they've done for education, literacy." And you might say, "Yeah, it's a good retaurical point." But
it's a good point until he's the uncle, just sitting in the corner there, voicing his opinion.
Uncle is nice to laugh at and have a great conversation. But I think as you mentioned, until that point when he won Nevada and became the front runner, and people started talking about him taking all the states.
Yeah.
Until that point, everyone thought fine. But then people realized no matter what, he is actually going to say this on stage with Donald Trump. And that's not going to play well. I mean, you can write the lines of those commercials. So I think that's,
Yeah, it was funny because, somebody was asking Trump after Super Tuesday when Biden did really well. And somebody was asking Trump if he's prepared for Biden. And he said, I was ready. I was ready for Bernie, socialist, all this, all that. So he was licking his lips at the prospect of, facing Bernie in the Democratic debate. So that tells you a lot, I suppose. Right. And sorry, go on, Suhag.
Just real quick, there was a great political cartoon where they had a bunch of people on the sidelines with red shirts and "Make America Great Again" hats cheering as Bernie's running through the finish line. So, to what you were saying, there's great political satire out there.
I mean, that I suppose it tells you a lot about your candidate if your opposition is stoked that he's doing really well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it is also interesting. I'd like to know what your, in your experience, what Indian Americans' attitudes towards Bernie Sanders has been, because for people based in India, people don't have the best opinion in India, at least in my experience, of Bernie Sanders, particularly because, he's been one of the few political candidates who's been very outspoken about certain things that have happened in India, in particular Kashmir and the Citizenship Amendment Act, And even when recently, we've already talked about all the stuff that he said about Kashmir that people, obviously India was very unhappy with. And even right now, I feel like, all right, Kashmir, you said something, you're not very educated, fine. But what really, soured me on him even more is when he put out some statements about the violence that happened in Delhi recently. And he came out, and two of his biggest supporters, Ilhan Omar and AOC, they came out and they made statements about what happened in Delhi as well. And they very unequivocally sort of painted what happened in Delhi as a Hindu attack on Muslims, which, even if you do a basic Google search, don't listen to me. I'm sure I'm a Hindutwadi, whatever. Don't listen to me. Just do a Google search of the victims of the violence in Delhi, and you'll find a very large number of Hindus among the victims and Muslims among the victims. So what it was a classical riot, is what happened in Delhi. And to paint it as some sort of a Hindu pogrom against Muslims, which is a word which is very commonly used, it's at best, if we give them the benefit of the doubt, it's extremely irresponsible, and at worst, it's extremely disingenuous. So I wonder what, after those kinds of statements, what kind of opinions do Indian Americans have of Bernie Sanders? So Aseem, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Well, you hit on a lot of the main points, John. Look, Bernie, he was initially supported by Tulsi, right? So
Right.
A lot of people were going to give, a lot of Indian Americans, Hindu Americans were going to give Bernie a lot of latitude, that if Tulsi saw something great in this guy, perhaps, he is. I mean, Hillary had a lot of issues of her own with vis-a-vis the community. Perhaps Bernie was going to give us a different path, forge a different path, a more, shall we say, an Obama-esque path was the hope, vis-a-vis India.
Yeah.
But those ideas came to a halt. What happened is, and whatever decision he made, that I'm going to play this base, I'm not going to play this base, or these are deeply held beliefs. Now, fine. Just like I was raised, as you might know, in South Florida. Faiz Shakir, the Pakistani American who supported, who's the campaign manager for Bernie, grew up in South Florida. Just another, brown kid from South Florida. So, how much does he deeply hold these views, and did that influence him or not? We don't know. But he took a very anti-India line very early, which really surprised me. He came out on Kashmir loud and clear that this was, a bad move, that this was a human rights violation.
I think, sorry to butt in really quickly, Aseem, but I think what was also very telling is that he made this grand declaration about Kashmir at ISNACon. Like, he makes it at the Islamic Students Conference. I think that's very pointed.
Yeah, exactly. The audience. Okay, was he playing to an audience, or these are deeply held beliefs? But, so he hit Kashmir, then he hit CAA, and then he hit the Delhi riots, sort of the trifecta of, and then you can see who his proxies are, who are his surrogates, and whether it's Mehdi Hasan, some of the other writers at The Intercept, is it, some of the people who are the most floridly anti-India, anti-Tulsi, kind of goes together. They all coalesce behind him. And it looked like a one-issue type of thing. You stand with Kashmir, and you look at various internet portals. Who knows who runs these portals? All of them, became big surrogates for Bernie. And I think the community saw that he's taken a side, which is never a smart thing. And I think Suhag has tweeted about that. You have you can look at the numbers. You have 3 million Hindu Americans, at least 1 million voters. And if you look at the states where they're concentrated, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, they're enough to change a district. They're enough to change a voting number. I mean, let's not exaggerate the importance of the Indian American vote, but in certain districts, it can actually play a pivotal role. I mean, elections these days are decided by, 100 votes.
Right. There's the states like Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, even Minnesota. These are all areas that have growing Indian American populations that are just slightly under 1%. So those are some significant numbers. I will say, there was a national Asian American survey, and according to that, only 1/3 of Indian Americans reported getting any sort of call or party from either party.
Wow.
So I think that should send a signal to the two parties. I think that probably of late, you're probably seeing more overt efforts coming from the Republican Party in terms of making that sort of outreach. And it showed in Houston. If you look at the breakdown of which party was represented more on stage, it was a visible demonstration. So personally, I think that our community is healthiest if we have, a good number of, Indian American Republicans and a good number of Indian American Democrats, because we're not just a one issue community.
Yeah.
Sure, the U.S.-India relationship is a very important one and plays front and center. And I think there's probably a generational difference in terms of who it plays front and center for.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of other issues, and both parties aren't necessarily going to promote those issues in a way that best serves our community. And so I think that more outreach and sincere outreach, not just, hey, we have a Appia guy, and so he's going to, but a really sincere effort where you're holding town halls, finding out from the community what's important to them, would go a long ways.
Yeah, what was very interesting is, Tulsi Gabbard recently dropped out of the race and she endorsed Biden, and a lot of people were very surprised about that. But I can understand people's surprise, but I don't understand people's shock, because a lot of people are like, oh my God, I am shocked that she endorsed Biden and not Bernie. Well, yeah, I get it. She was, Bernie's biggest supporter. She risked her career to support Bernie back in 2016, all of that stuff. But if you look at the election cycle in 2020, or since Tulsi's been running for the president position, one of the things you've noticed is that the Sanders campaign has gone out of its way to avoid talking about Tulsi Gabbard, to ignore her. I mean, I remember her campaign put out a statement where they were talking about only 2 candidates being in the race when Tulsi was still running,
right?
And they've, you've had, as Aseem was talking about, these surrogates of Bernie, these organizations and these people that support Bernie, who have come out and very overtly attacked Tulsi as being some sort of a Hindu fanatic, some sort of a Hindu nationalist, fascist, just because she has some sort of a friendly relationship with Modi, which, by the way, Obama had as well. I wonder what that makes Obama. But, it's so, yeah, I can understand people's surprise. But are you really, Suhag, shocked that Tulsi said, you know what, if you want to treat me that way, I'll just support Biden?
I'm not shocked. I mean, Tulsi has always been someone who is open to listening to different voices, taking all the facts into consideration and driving her policy from that stance. She's not an ideologue. And that's what you need to be on that far left camp. Now, I think that if you go back to 2016, Bernie represented that a little bit more, certainly than Hillary Clinton did. And so it was natural for her. And she took a huge risk career-wise to go against the party. And we saw what that resulted in this election cycle in terms of the shutout. But these are the very issues that she brought up last time. So I'm neither shocked nor surprised.
Really?
I think that she made a decision that's based on where she believes not only the party, but I think our democracy needs to be.
It's a tough call for her too, Aseem, I feel like, because, you had certain establishment Democrats like Hillary Clinton and her supporters that were calling her like a Assad apologist and a Russian agent. And then you had these Bernie supporters who were calling her a Hindu fundamentalist. Yeah. So she was a little bit between the devil and the deep blue sea. But there's a question here from Shashidhar and Karthikeyan. So let me ask you this question as well. She said, why did Tulsi endorse Biden? Wouldn't that make the Bernie supporters attack Hindu Americans even more now that sort of Tulsi's out of the picture and they don't have to pussyfoot around this issue anymore? So they can go, they can throw the kitchen sink at Hindu Americans now. Do you think that something that might happen?
Well, I would say this. Tulsi, in the end, what she was doing is doing what a politician should do.
Yeah.
I mean, she, as any presidential candidate, as she's stepping out, if we've seen that she's been very clear-eyed. None of us can place the burden of carrying the Indian American community or the Hindu American community squarely on her shoulders, that everything has to be, perfectly pitched for what would be good for the community. But what I think she did was very good for the community. I mean, from my circles, if you want an Indian American perspective, all of us were saying, gosh, I hope she doesn't endorse Sanders.
Right.
That would be a major disaster. Many people were just praying that if she did, who was now the most established anti-India, let's just say an anti-Hindu candidate.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
That Tulsi should not endorse him. And why should she? I mean, everyone, did he ever call off the dogs, so to speak? And I say that metaphorically.
Yeah, never.
Did he ever call off, Reza Aslan, Wajahat Ali, Mehdi Hasan, all the people who very loudly, floridly attacked Tulsi and on personal terms as some sort of Modi surrogate, when all she had ever done is met him as any other, we can make a list of 50 congressmen who sat down with Modi and talked to him.
Well, essentially, you're saying every single person at Howdy Modi or every single diplomat that attended the India trip with Trump is now a Hindu fanatic.
Supposedly, that you've been besmirched by having, been doing that. That witch hunt mentality, and Bernie never openly supported Tulsi. Tulsi, to her credit, said, no, I don't think Ilhan Omar is anti-Semitic. Remember when Ilhan Omar was under full attack, Tulsi was one of the few who stood up. Did she return the favor?
She was the one that stood up for Bernie when Elizabeth Warren called him a sexist too.
When he did, exactly. Did they ever, so I think this is the game of politics. So, and to his question, Karthikeyan's question, I don't think this has hurt the Indian community at all. The people who are already attacking Hindu Americans for being, being fundamentalists or supporting Delhi riots or financially supporting the BJP, which is the biggest joke because there's really no way to send money from the U.S. to an Indian political party. No one has ever shown, but they always throw that out there, that Indian American Hindus are sending money and supporting the BJP so they could, carry on. So this is all nonsensical. So I wouldn't worry. For us as an Indian American community, I think there was a lot of relief that Tulsi supported Biden, and Bernie has, gone the way that most of us hoped.
I'll just quickly add here that I think Tulsi took a lot of bullets, I think, for the Hindu American community. In terms of, we were looking at this and saying, hey, this is a great opportunity for us to start educating the public about who we are and what we believe and what we stand for. And instead, we were defending our right to be a part of the political process. We were defending our right to make contributions, not just to Hindu American candidates, but to others. So I think this served as a wake-up call. I think our relative success in this country has given us this veil of comfort. And it was enough, I think, for a lot of people to write that check, get a picture, and move beyond that. But I've seen that the attacks on Tulsi, in addition to some of the, rabid comments that have come out from the fringe element of the Democratic Party, have been a catalyst for action. So, we meaning the Hindu American Foundation has been advocating on a variety of issues. And to get people to just click a button and send a letter or to pick up the phone and call was such a hike. Right. And then you take something like House Resolution 745. Just a few weeks ago, where there was a chance that it was going to come up for markup. That was a resolution that had been proposed by Representative Pramila Jayapal, criticizing the government of India for the abrogation and a number of other Kashmir-related issues without acknowledging the toll terrorism has taken on the country. Right.
nor acknowledging the cleansing of 350,000.
And that's what happened during those hearings as well, right?
Right, exactly.
It was one side as you can get.
Exactly. A matter of 48 hours, over 3,000 letters went through. This is unheard of.
Wow.
So I think that, yes, the attacks hurt, but to Aseem's point, I think it's kind of a blessing in disguise, or maybe not a disguise, but an overt blessing.
Right. Yeah, I remember because there was a congressman who shared an article written by some guy who was making the incredible point that just because some Hindu sounding names are donating to Tulsi's campaign, that makes her some kind of a fascist, which is an amazing point to make. So thanks for that, mate. But, somebody shared that article and said, oh, wow, look at that. Such an important article. This is this, Indian American congressman. And there's been Indian American congressmen who've been sort of at the forefront, almost sort of bending over backwards to ingratiate themselves to Bernie Sanders and, their ilk, to be like, yeah, we're one of you. Don't worry about it. We'll say whatever you need us to say. To an extent. And I feel like that also, from at least whatever I saw on social media, that did, generate a large amount of pushback from the Indian American community. It's like, well, you're not, you might be Indian Americans, but you're not representing these issues in an honest way at all. So I wonder if you noticed that at all, Aseem, that kind of pushback against the sort of Indian American candidates or politicians who were, making these claims.
Yeah, Sham, that's been quite a journey. You might know that there's a PAC called the Hindu American Political Action Committee, APAC. And the PAC has supported candidates. The PAC supported Pramila Jayapal in the beginning. Right. She called, she solicited support, explained where she would stand on the issues, her Hindu upbringing, her belief system. And look, her, Tulsi, the PAC supported Tulsi years ago when, she hadn't even run for her first congressional seat, right. Sitting in her apartment in Hawaii with the pines and the, sun coming in, and
right.
a conversation with her, invested in her. There were a lot of people that the PAC is invested in. It's like a return of ROI. What we found over the years, or what the PAC has found, is that in some cases, there's a very amazing return, and
right.
They really stand up for the community. They're overt about it. They'll take the hits for the community, and they'll be unapologetic in their stances. But there are those that, for whatever compunctions, and we can speculate that what took Pramila Jayapal into this crazy space that she started to occupy,
right.
Sort of as an antagonist in the Hindu American community. I mean, unbelievable. Why? Ro Khanna played his, games and unapologetically took his stance. But I think there are plenty of congressional candidates who are, working hard. But I do have to say that it is a difficult environment for them. The pressures that we feel as Hindu American advocates, they're feeling it at sort of at a 10 times magnified place. They're under the microscope. Some congressional Hindu American candidates have said that this Pramila Jayapal bill is a huge problem, because it's sort of forcing them to make a open declaration that, no, I'm against this bill.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but you're against human rights in Kashmir. And so, it's been framed, when it's put out by an Indian American congresswoman, it puts a lot of pressure on many of our Indian American candidates to sign. And these types of things, there's a lot of dynamics at play. And I think what I would say is that the community has to really come together, has to support different ways of giving. As Suhag said, it should be on the Republican side, the Democratic side. It should be bipartisan. But you got to get out there and support, and show support to those congressional candidates who are at least standing up for the community. If you don't have that, you're really going to have no surrogates, and you're not going to have that voice on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, I think sort of Hindu American candidates and Indian American candidates are in a tricky spot as well, in the sense that, when you were talking about the pressures they have on them, they have this sort of pressure from the woke side of the Democratic Party, and they have a certain amount of pressure from the evangelical side of the Republican Party, which I think is an important discussion to have as well, which we'll get to in a second. But I want to finish off the Democratic side of the discussion. We're talking about Joe Biden first, because, Tulsi obviously came out and supported Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's taken a very conciliatory sort of tone about how he wants to go about his campaign. He wants to bring people together. He's not someone, he's almost presented himself as the anti-Bernie. I am not looking here to tear down institutions and, call out people. I'm here to unite people, which is something that's obviously resonated with the American electorate, judging by his performances. So what is sort of the Indian American community's stance on somebody like Joe Biden, especially with his, with the opinions he's been sharing and the stance he's been taking? So let me get to you, Suhag.
Okay, so if we look back at Hillary Clinton, 77%, according to that same survey that I talked about before, 77% of Indian Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, 16% voted for Trump. In our conversations with different communities across the United States, I have at least been hearing a lot of let me say it this way. We've been seeing increasing numbers of community members talking about the Republican Party. So, there is a shift. It's hard to know what that shift might be. If Sanders had been there, I think we could err on the side of predict shift. But with President Biden there, if he continues the track record that President Obama started, which, for all intents and purposes, I'm pretty sure it's going to be similar, if not the same.
Right.
Then, it's going to have to come to other issues. That's not going to be kind of the litmus test for a particular candidate. It might be, how friendly is this particular candidate going to be with small businesses? How was the handling of this COVID crisis? I mean, there's going to be a lot more factors beyond the U.S.-India relationship, in my estimation, because you certainly have, a positive relationship, although it's fraught on trade and certain deals and things like that with the current administration. And you had a similar issue with President Obama, where, some reports say that he called Prime Minister Modi on his way out. So there was obviously a close relationship there. So it's two good choices, I think, so long as things stay status quo. Aseem can maybe talk about, with Amit Jani and some of the things that we've seen come up. And I think that, I won't say anything more. Aseem, you can maybe talk about that.
Well, Suhag makes a good point that Biden emerging as a front runner carries the potential of taking U.S.-India out of the equation, so that the voters can just start focusing again on where their stance is on all the other issues that she talked about. And up to when it was Bernie Sanders, there was a real risk of a cleavage between young generation, millennials, and older Indian Americans who care about India, and the millennials who perhaps don't care as much about India. There was a risk of a big cleavage. Now with Biden in the game and the likely front runner, that could change. Now Biden could screw this up. They could make a very bad move on making some statement. Because what's been interesting is that a lot of the proxies who had rushed over to Sanders are now sort of trying to push. You get that moment of leverage. You often say you have leverage for a minute in your life, right? You go for a new job. You're being recruited. Here's a chance. They're being recruited to join the Biden camp's so-called recruitment. That's their moment of leverage. Okay, look, we'll come to you, but give us this, give us that. We want a statement on India. And from inside the campaign that there's a lot of pressure, not inside the campaign, but I'm hearing from people in the community that there are a lot of people who are, Biden, Sanders supporters who are now pushing Biden surrogates to get Biden to issue a statement against India on human rights, on Kashmir, on Delhi riots, on CAA. So there's a lot of pressure. Does he cave or not? We're going to be watching that very closely. That's going to tell us how he's going to be responsive to this incoming. There is a lot of incoming in that regard. And that takes us to Amit Jani. The same people who have been the biggest Sanders supporters have now, raised this level of pressure on social media. It's been thus far a social media campaign, and we know that they've been contacting surrogates, close advisors to Biden, and pushing him to do something about Amit Jani. It started with Amit Jani, just for background, is a young man in the Indian American community, raised in Edison, New Jersey. He has been involved in politics in the state of New Jersey for years. He served Senator Menendez. He's worked on the governor's, Phil Murphy's administration. He's been with other congressmen, with Frank Pallone. So he's gone through, the entire smorgasbord of candidates in New Jersey. So this is a man with a lot of inside political experience who very rightfully was hired by the Biden campaign. And he joined the Biden campaign long before Biden was even close to being a front runner, and joined him as the National Asian American Pacific Islander Community Outreach Director. Word got out that, like any of us, perhaps my own, sons, at some point he had gotten a photo with Modi. His father, who has passed away, had been a very active person in the 80s, had started OFBJP. Now, OFBJP in those days was a social organization. People got together, they talked about, had a discussion like us about politics, supported perhaps the BJP in India. Suresh Jani, Amit Jani's dad, had grown up with Modi back in their North Gujarat days, Mehsana days, long before the move to the US. And so, sort of supportive organization. It does nothing except, have meetings and discuss politics in India. Amit Jani was never involved with OFBJP, but, Amit Jani had a photo with Narendra Modi when he came because he was a close friend of his father. And this was put all over, again, you got the photo with Modi, just like Tulsi, now you were a target. And people, really sort of came after Amit. Thus far, to the Biden administration credit, Biden campaign, they have not affected him. They did bring in a Muslim outreach director, which is, fine.
That's fine, yeah.
But they have not changed his position, so we're watching. Do they do something to Amit Jani? Do they make a statement on India? That could change the whole equation.
Yeah, it is funny because, Biden already has disadvantages. He doesn't need to add any more, because Trump, again, somebody was talking to Trump about, I think he was on Fox News or something, and he was talking about, are you, looks like Biden's going to be it. Are you ready for Biden? You're preparing for Bernie. And he said, look, I'm preparing for Bernie. That's fine. But they're both wonderful for me. That's, he said, they're both wonderful for me. I can go after both of them just as easily. Yeah. One of them's an old communist. The other one's just old, so he, and there's a political commentator, Ben Shapiro. He always calls Trump a mud monster. He says, this guy's a mud monster. Yeah. He will grab you and he will drag you into the mud. Mm-hmm. If you're used to fighting in the mud, maybe you'll survive. But somebody like Joe Biden, he almost conducts himself as a statesman. Like an Obama. Like Obama was a statesman. Yeah. And if you think, you're going to run this election or you're going to run this campaign as a statesman, well, I've got news for you. You're not facing a statement. You're facing a mud monster. No. So
yes.
Yeah. So I feel like Biden already has disadvantages. I hope he plays this smartly and sort of doesn't add to the list of disadvantages he already has.
Right. Well, what you're saying right now and these messages we've been sending to the campaign, don't mess this up. It would just be an easy gift that they could really, have a very influential, powerful vote bank. And why mess that up with doing something dumb, caving in to this type of pressure? Because if he does that now, you can only imagine the kind of pressure you're going to get over 4 years of an administration. So,
and just a random thought is that Delaware, I think it was a Pew report that showed that Delaware had the fastest growing Hindu American community in the United States. It's this very small state, but it's corporate headquarters for so many because of some very corporate friendly laws. So maybe a message out to any Hindu Americans in Delaware. If you have supported Vice President Biden as a senator or at any time throughout his long career in public service, this is the time to give him a call and provide the type of context that where our community is on not just this issue, the U.S.-India friendship, which I think there's solid ground, but how a young Indian American is treated because of these accusations that have come against him that are ludicrous. You're supposed to be held guilty for something that your parents were involved in.
Right.
That's number one. But number two, then who else are we going to go after? I mean, we've seen the three large rallies in New York, in California, and in Houston, where you have CEOs of major companies, CEOs of smaller companies, and citizens of all backgrounds wanting to have just a few minutes with the prime minister, with an idea or, with an interest in wanting to do something in India. Right. So it's really not something that would make much sense in messing up.
Right. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that as well. And I feel like that's a good time to segue to sort of the Republican side of these things, because, one of the things that I always hear from India, you see that in India a lot. There's a big Modi Trump fan base in India. Trump, a lot of Indians that are sort of very jaded, and rightfully so, very jaded with the mainstream media and the way the mainstream media has treated them, and the way the mainstream intelligentsia in India has treated these people and looked down upon these people. So you can completely understand why. But there is a big fan base for Trump in India where they're like, he takes it to the liberals. He tells them like it is. He's not afraid to get down and dirty and pull up his sleeves and throw a few punches. So I get that. And even with, the seeming camaraderie between Modi and Trump, that's only gone to sort of strengthen the fan base's belief in Trump. And by all accounts, it does look like Trump is someone who is friendly towards India and who wants to develop better relationship towards India. But I think what Trump really is he's a very transactional guy. He's a very quid pro quo kind of guy. So a lot of people think that this guy just loves India and is always going to be India's friend no matter what. I don't believe that to be the case. I don't believe that to be the truth. Trump's a very you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours kind of guy. So, he will support India, but if, Modi can do something like a Howdy Modi, and if Modi can actually translate something like a Howdy Modi into a transfer of votes from Democrats to Republicans, that's something that, somebody like Trump can get behind. He's like, all right, if you can give me something, I can give you something. So is that how you see somebody like Donald Trump as well, Suhag, or do you see him as like a, all-weather friend?
So, I mean, I just think that his history is reflective of that. I mean, he's been a Democrat as well, and now he's a Republican. So I think that your assessment, really encapsulates maybe his philosophy. Yeah. I will say that, and I'll take this to the Hindu American Foundation and our experience in advocating for both civil rights and human rights. We have, we are nonpartisan on paper, but our portfolio actually is very easy to remain bipartisan, because when we're looking at a lot of issues like immigration or hate crimes prevention or the separation of church and state, we tend to get, more support on certain issues, or we're aligning with left. And then when we're looking at things like foreign policy or human rights, or security and things like that, it's very easy to find more support on the right. So in that sense, if you're looking at just kind of the center of the political spectrum, I don't think Indian Americans and Hindu Americans can go wrong. Where things start changing are in two places. One is the fringe of both parties, where you have a very conservative evangelical presence and stronghold on the right, and we've already spoken about kind of the woke stronghold on the left. So the far right is going to impact us, I think, at the local level. How much does religion seep into policy, whether it's prayer in school, whether it's mandatory biblical lessons and things like that, where, at least on paper, the US Constitution guarantees the separation of church and state. So on those types of issues, or even immigration, where, the center is probably going to be a little bit more reasonable on lifting country caps, on, increasing immigration, whether it's on the basis of supporting the economy or for humanitarian. The center is going to be a little bit more reasonable in terms of doing things that are going to allow people to continue coming into the country and contribute to our economy and to our society. But on either end, I think, again, looking to the community, we need to understand, or people in India need to understand, that the U.S.-India relationship, while it might be an important issue, is not the only issue.
Right.
There are so many other things that are going to impact people at the local level as well.
Yeah, and Aseem, speaking about the sort of evangelical presence or the stronghold on the right as well, you have every time the Indian government takes some kind of an action, you always hear from the USCIRF. Mm-hmm. And the USCIRF is not not dominated by the woke left. The commissioners of the USCIRF, a lot of them are, have connections to, evangelical organizations. So you have, the woke left that we were talking about, on the one hand, that's attacking India after every decision, but then you have an organization dominated by evangelicals that are also attacking India at every chance they get in the shape of the USCIRF. So I think that's another little caveat, and that's another little shade of this discussion that people in India, and I think Indian Americans understand it generally better than, I suppose, people in India, because people in India are a lot like Republican or bust. They're all like, screw the Democrat, let's just go with the Republicans. Why can't these Indian Americans just wrap their heads around it and just vote Republican? So I think there are circumstances that prevent Indian Americans from voting Republican as well. And I feel like the sort of strong evangelical presence on the right and the evangelical bullishness on the right, I think it's a very big factor, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Suhag and you have gotten on to a T. There is a stranglehold, and the Indian American, Hindu American community really has to chart its own course. You're being buffeted by both sides. You can talk about a nexus. You can talk about intersectionality. You can talk about, in various different ways that these powers are sort of putting you on one side. You are the oppressor. You are, on the wrong side of the intersectional movement. On the other side, you're Hindu, you're a non-believer, you're not in the evangelical side. And you have to sort of chart your way and make a decision and really go for a presidential candidate who is not going to be unduly influenced by these power or these, interest banks that are out there. So as you rightly said, USCIRF, USCIRF, that, project, an evangelical project, the Federalist Society leaders, Frank Leo, some of the earliest commissioners. If you see the type of people who are sitting on the commission right now, it really has become a tool of that sort of policy, and it's used, right? So right now, the intersectional people, the caste groups, and the Indian Christian groups and Muslim groups are very strongly supporters of USCIRF and are witnesses at every hearing, and the Hindu community is sort of locked out of those. On the other hand, it has been different at different times, right? So when the focus is Bangladesh, suddenly you have this whole different change. So, people kind of get the game that, all right, they're going to do this. They'll probably list India as a CPC, country of particular concern.
Right.
I think finally we've grown enough to say, who cares? That India is going to navigate and make its own decisions the way it sees fit. Now, Suhag can talk about how the Indian government could be communicating things a whole heck of a lot better. But, I think in terms of policy, in terms of who we vote for, we really have to make a decision who is going to do something in the grander scheme. I mean, just really quickly, Trump, sure, he's been a great friend to Modi. He's shown support for India on his various different foreign internal policy debates by just staying out. To show support is to just stay out of the
That's the best way to show support, I feel. Yeah.
Right. And let India make its decisions that are best for it as a sovereign country. So he's done that. But on the other hand, I was just in India a few months ago, and I have two cousins who are very well-trained electrical engineers whose H-1Bs didn't get renewed because a country cap got hit. And now, what they are? They're in India. One's in Germany and one's going to Canada. So these are smartest, the best and brightest who, because of Trump's, myopic policy, are going to be in other countries, strengthening those countries, and we're missing that talent at home. So, the community can see it and feel it, that you can't make this a one-issue thing. Oh, he's great on India, and he's going to stick to the leftists. You have to make a broader decision.
I think also that I like this terminology that's come up in terms of left and non-left in India. People need to also understand in India that the left and right it's different here.
Yeah,
there are definitely shared elements of the far left in the United States and the far left in India, and they very often overlap and work together.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. But there are key differences in the culture and in the values of both sides of those spectrums. I brought this up in another podcast that I was on, but we hold briefings on Capitol Hill to educate staffers on just a more contextualized and nuanced understanding of India. And so we had a briefing after the election. And so I read off a manifesto, a political platform manifesto. And I said, we're talking about climate change as a moral imperative. We're talking about increasing microfinance loans for women. We're talking about transgender integration into society. Raise your hand if you think this is the left party. And unanimous, everyone raised their hand. I'm like, by the way, I just read off the BJP manifesto. So I think that even people here in the United States have to get a better understanding and not to toss words around like left and right, because they mean very different things in these different contexts, as does secularism. India's version of secularism is very different, whether we look at it in concept and theory or as in practice, two very different models.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And I remember I was talking to someone, I was talking to this progressive YouTube channel that invited me over to talk about the BJP and the RSS. And they were talking to me about, Modi's Hindu nationalist agenda, rah, rah, rah. And I told them about, the India's version of Medicare for all, the whole Ayushman Bharat scheme that Modi has launched. And they couldn't believe it. They're like, wait, that's Modi's scheme? I'm like, yeah. That's why when I tell you the right wing in India is not like the right wing in America, believe it. Because the right wing in India is just as socialist economically as the left wing in America. I mean, Modi's economic agenda and Sanders' economic agenda are not very dissimilar. So in terms of the economic policies, they're not really that different. So to understand India, you really have to look at India specifically. You can't study India through an American lens. It's very hard to understand India that way. So let me ask you, Aseem, when you say, the Indian American community has to chart its own path, what do you see? What do you project, if you had to sort of maybe guess and to project a little bit into the future in the next 10 years, in the next 2 or 3 election cycles? What do you see the Indian American voter base looking as in terms of Republican, Democrat, or what do you see their voting patterns change much?
That's an interesting question. I was just thinking that, in fact, during the conversation. Look, I was, I'll just say it online, right? I just turned 50 years old. I was born in this country, so 50 years. We've got. So when I was born, Nixon was president.
You look a day over 41, mate.
Yeah, there you go. I like you already, Shah. But so when I was born, Nixon, right? Nixon was president, and and we know what he did with the Seventh Fleet, and during the India-Bangladesh War, where that administration sat. We read the Blood Telegram, and you read some great books about what Kissinger was doing and what Nixon was doing. My parents, when my dad came to this country in 1962, Kennedy was president, and there was this really warm feeling that Kennedy and India, and he has very warm feelings, and he's come to India. He's met, I think he had met Nehru at one time, and there was this feeling that between Democrats and Republicans, Democrats are the ones that are going to stand with India, that they respect India, that they share values with Indians, with secularism, with rights, and I think those were the words, right? And people really deeply believe that, and the liberalization of the green card regime and all of those things, friendly towards immigration. And we went through Reagan years, we went through the first Bush, and there was the the Indo-Pak policy. That if you went to visit India, you had to visit Pakistan. You didn't say India without saying Pakistan. You had to treat both equally, as if they were two equal powers. And there's been a lot of push to sort of separate that. And as I look back, I can't say that this Republicans were better or Democrats were better. It really comes to a person thing, because Obama has been equally good. George W. Bush was quite good to India. Clinton, sort of in the middle, not great. And we can talk about reasons why, but I think that now I say this with full knowledge and knowing well Indian American leaders who are very committed Democrats and very committed Republicans, and I say good for them, because we need those people to be a nucleus, a core nucleus in each political party. Just a quick mention that I met a young candidate who's running for a state level election. I don't believe in anything this person necessarily believes in terms of Medicare for all, this and that. But why did I support that person? Well, I support them because Indian Americans really, it's our duty to get a nucleus core group of Indian American leaders in. And Hindu American. We had a big discussion about recognizing, himself, herself as a Hindu American, seeing that, because they tend to see their identity as Indian American, Asian American. What? Hindu American? I've never really thought of that. So we have this whole conversation. So to me, our community is going to be diverse going forward. It's not as simple as, the millennials will be Democrats, the older people who have, established and have money are going to vote Republican. I don't think it's that easy, and I don't think it's going to be that clear. I wish I could tell you where we'll be in 10 years, but I think you're going to see a diversity. You're going to see a great equalization. But I think, you'll still see Karthik Ramakrishnan, who keeps his survey at UC Irvine or UC Riverside, could probably give you a better, scientific answer. I think it'll tend to be a little bit to the left, a little bit Democrat, but it's not going to be 80% as it was in the last election. That's my,
It does make me think, like Suhag, that one of the, Aseem was talking about that cleavage earlier, about the sort of, if Bernie Sanders was still in the race between the sort of older Indian Americans, Hindu Americans, and the younger ones that maybe do not associate with India as strongly as the older ones do. And I wonder, like in your experience working with the Hindu American Foundation and interacting with Hindu American families, what has been your experience? Because I feel like that dictates to an extent Hindu Americans' attitudes towards India, and then towards certain politicians that have certain attitudes towards India, and maybe the Hindu community in general. Because my experience has been relatively mixed, and I do concede that my experience is very limited, obviously. But my experience has been mixed as in, I talked to some of the Indian Americans that have lived in, that were born in India, that were in America, and that were raised here, and that are sort of on the younger side of the spectrum around my age group. And they don't really associate themselves too strongly with their Hindu identity. And I don't even necessarily mean that religiously. I don't mean that they're overly religious and they're in the mandir all the time or anything like that. But even like a cultural identification with their identity, which is something you see very strongly in like Jewish communities, even if they're not very overtly religious, but they still have that, sort of cultural identification within themselves. But to what extent do you see that in sort of the younger Indian American community?
So, Aseem and I are probably on the older end of kind of that second generation, the earliest people, right?
Sure.
Meaning that our parents came in the 50s and 60s. And so we were kind of that first group of people who were born and raised in the United States. So our childhoods were shaped by actually the temples growing up alongside us. It's not like we moved to America and, oh, hey, there's a temple in our city and let's go enroll in the Bal Vihar. The first thing people were doing is building temples. Then maybe 5-10 years later, people are like, oh, our children don't really understand why they're coming here. Let's establish Bal Vihars as part of the temple. So there is, I believe, a generation that doesn't, they maybe more readily identify as Indian Americans and not as Hindu Americans. So there's that. It would be interesting to see someone actually study identification amongst not just largely the Indian American community, but also looking at generational data, whether someone was born and raised here, at what age did they come here? Did they spend most of their childhood here? What I'm seeing now, though, so I would say, I think the stat is that from 2010 to 2015, or maybe.
Nope.
Uh-oh.
Lost her. Well, I if I could just finish her thought. That's a great.
Okay, so the Indian American and the Hindu American population doubled. There has been an explosion of temples and institutions that have been built for language, culture, etc. What I see in, say, the 30 and below set are people who grew up knowing the traditions, understanding them and really being immersed in them in a way that someone maybe say 35 or to 50 may not have been. So, and we're also talking about a generation that grew up post 9/11.
Right.
So where, even before 9/11, I don't know that most people kind of wore their religious identity on their sleeve in the way that people have post 9/11. So I am seeing an increasing number of people in that age range who do identify as Hindu Americans. I would say that in our interactions on the Hill, Capitol Hill, for those of people who may not refer to Washington, D.C. as the Hill, I have seen young Indian Americans working in offices for both sides of the aisle, in Republican offices as well as Democratic offices. So, but I would still say that largely by all the surveys, it's, very easily a majority that affiliate with the Democratic Party. Right. I was going to say one more thing. Oh, the other factor that might impact or influence someone's political affiliation is what part of the United States they live in. So, someone who lives in the Bible Belt might, they're surrounded by different issues, might choose to identify a particular way politically because of their circumstance. Are they in a large city? Are they in a small city? Are they in a rural area? Are they in a metropolitan area? All these things. And then what is the prevalent political environment around them? So there's so many different factors that might influence what someone decides to associate as. And then we don't really know what happens at the ballot box. Are they zigzag voting? Are they really just down the line voting for the party that they are affiliated with? So there's, I think, a lot of complexity to Indian Americans and how we identify with a particular party and how we're going to vote on different issues.
I think that's healthy too, isn't it? I
Absolutely.
think that's very healthy. I think that kind of diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of political affiliation, I think that's very healthy for a community to have, which would, it's a great sign of a community truly integrating into the country, isn't it?
Sham, I'll say one thing to add on to what Suhag said. This concept of Hindu American, when we started using that word about 17 years ago, that, going to Congress, oh, we're the Hindu American. Oh, you're Indian, right? Yeah, yes, we're Indian. But we're also Hindu American because, as you know, on HAF, I think how many, 3 or 4 staff members are of, non-Indian origin, but they're Hindu. They completely view themselves and are devout Hindus. So, we started using the word Hindu American, and it is very interesting how people are so reluctant to use that term. And I was talking to a young, candidate that I was meeting with, and I said, so do you see yourself as Hindu American? Kind of looked at me and he said, well, I see myself as Asian American. I see myself as Indian American. I'm Hindu. But, I guess I've never really seen that as a public identity. And I said, well, when the Hoboken mayor was elected, he became the first Sikh, Ravi Bhala, became the first Sikh American, mayor of a big city. When Grewal was named the Attorney General of New Jersey, he became the first Sikh American, wore that very proudly. You can see it. You don't have to wear it. I mean, it's their very identity. Sikh Americans they even have merged it into an ethnicity. I'm not exactly sure how that's an ethnicity, but, they have to wear that as an ethnicity. So, the Muslim American candidates, same thing. They'll very openly, Ilhan Omar is the first Muslim, or not first, but, a Muslim American candidate. Rashida Tlaib is a Muslim American congresswoman. And that's great. That's important because, we are a minority. These are minority faiths. To declare that is to give some backing and to let other, my kids know that, wow, people who practice my faith have elevated, have gone to these, different career paths that maybe I had not thought of that I could see myself in. So there is, I was at a fundraiser once with Rajiv Ram, the tennis star. He's won the bronze medal at the Olympics. He's won double championships, I think just at the Australian Open recently. And he spoke very openly about his Hindu American identity. He was at a HAF event. And he's so proudly speaking of, as a Hindu American, my faith is very important to me. It inspires me. I read the Gita. We were talking to Rajiv Srinivasan, a soldier, West Point graduate who was in the front lines in Afghanistan. I mean, walking with a rifle, and talked about how he read the Gita and Arjun's, conversations with Krishna as a warrior, how that inspired him. When they talked about that, I actually went to an older, perhaps my parents' generation, or maybe some years older than me. Isn't it amazing that these young people, my generation really didn't, but this generation is seeing themselves as Hindu American as much as Indian American. And that couple, what they said? They said, I don't know. I don't know if that's good. So there is this inherent reluctance that somehow to say I'm Hindu American makes me anti-something. Yeah. And how do we break that mold? We're working on that.
Well, that's that I feel like that malaise has carried over from India essentially, because in India it's seen as like you always pussyfoot around this topic. You don't really call yourself a Hindu in India because it's considered weird. Don't call yourself a Hindu. What's wrong with you? Like it's considered weird in the cradle of Hindu civilization.
You're a fundamentalist.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas if you
nice line.
and sort of Bollywood's also taken that and it's created that image. I remember watching so many Bollywood movies that it's almost like subliminal to this point, where you see like a Muslim man with a long beard and with a little, that mala in his hand, and he's reciting the prayer, and he's always portrayed as a very pious, upstanding man. Always, almost always. And you see the Hindu with the tilak and the little shikha in the back, and he's always this covetous, like slimy guy, always out to get the little man, So it's almost like this thing where if you're overt with your identity, then there's something wrong with you. Like, why are you, why are you presenting yourself as something like that? So I think that's a carryover from India. That's an Indian disease that's still, Indians are still trying to get rid of in other countries. But I think finally, I think it's interesting to discuss, like, over the time that you guys have been involved with the Hindu American Foundation, you guys obviously got started in a time where sort of speaking or pushing back against any kind of narrative that existed against Hindus in America was non-existent. It wasn't there, which is why you started the foundation in the first place. So from that situation to today in 2020, what sort of a progress do you feel like the Hindu community in America has made in terms of being able to have a voice and have some sort of a representation where they're able to push back against somebody like a Bernie Sanders, or somebody like an Ilhan Omar or an AOC, who maybe isn't either educated on the matter or just has these opinions that are deeply problematic and paint Hindus in a certain light? What kind of a pushback, or what kind of a, an ability of the Hindu community to speak up for themselves do you see between that time to today? Let me come to you, Suhag, first.
That's a good question. I feel that we were on a positive trajectory in terms. I mean, for HAF, for sure, when it comes to just general stories, human interest stories on Hinduism, I think we've made a lot of progress in building an institution that's become a resource for many people who want to cover the local stories. They want to know, hey, what festivals do you have in September that I can go to? And so they do a feature on Navratri, or they're interested in Diwali or Holi. And, so on that level, I think that we've made a great deal of progress, because prior to that, a journalist wouldn't know where to call. And if they call their local temple, it may not be open on a Wednesday at like 1 p.m. or there might be not, it might be open, but there not be someone who's answering the phone that can answer their question. So in that regard, I think that a lot of progress has been made. We've been able to platforms to work on things like religion style books so that the proper terminology is used. We've certainly also created a lot of content. And even beyond just HAF, I think the internet has cast open a wide world of good and bad content in terms of anyone who's interested in learning about Hinduism. There's a lot of information out there. But I will say that on the political front, it feels like some days it feels like we're starting from scratch.
Really?
Especially, I would say that after the BJP came into power, you have an English media in India that is largely against the current administration, and then they're the folks on the ground there are going to be the sources for the major media outlets here, like the New York Times, and so you just have this one narrative, and that's not nuanced. You brought up the Delhi riots. Well, the average American probably thinks that all of the death toll is one-sided. Now, that I don't want to get into like, sure, Olympics on, who lost more or whatever. It's not a contest in that sense, but to better understand what's going on, you need to have kind of just a reporting of the facts, and we don't get that anymore. So, for the Hindu American Foundation, our job is not to, defend all the actions of the Indian government. That's not what we're there for. Historically, we've also been critical on issues of the handling of Kashmir prior to the abrogation of 370, or the handling of refugees prior to the CAA, where we've worked directly with Pakistani.
You criticized CAA as well, though.
Right. Exactly. So, in that sense, but it makes that job all the more harder when you have an avalanche of misinformation, because then you have people on the ground who are very hypersensitive, and they're going to attack you for even the constructive criticism that you're offering on a policy level. Right. So at least in this political space, what the internet has done also is globalized these problems so that whatever perceptions there are of a Hindu majority in India, they get translated to Hindu Americans here. Well, we're a minority here. And so the challenges are going to be different. So just at least on that front, I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of us being able to speak out. And maybe in some sense that trend is not just in the Indian context, but in the broader context as well, where you just have kind of this polarization of the media. And so it's not necessarily just a Hindu problem or an Indian problem, but maybe just a general trend that we're getting caught up into. The bigger challenge for us is that there's already a knowledge gap of India. So then people aren't able to recognize it. The second challenge is that a lot of these reporters are brown. They are in origin. They have Hindu names. So then when you say, well, this is replete with anti-Hindu bias, an average white person's like, wait, but isn't he Hindu? So those are kind of some of our unique challenges.
Yeah, I can't believe brown people lie too. It's unbelievable, right?
They might have a viewpoint.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Just to take off where she ended, and I'm sure you're probably getting to that point, Sham. But I would say that that journey has been changing. It has its curves, its plateaus. It has its we go up and down, and this has been difficult. And when India has a putatively Hindu government, and that reflects on so policy positions that HAF has advocated for forever, right? So has been about Kashmir, the full story of Kashmir, the integration of Kashmir, the Kashmiri Pundits. 370 changed that, so obviously that affected what we had been advocating for.
Right.
So HAF got caught up into that. I, as a physician, had been to Jodhpur. I worked in the refugee camps there for Pakistani Hindus who had, forcibly migrated there, fleeing persecution. So we have been very loudly, and we've also supported and worked in the Bhutanese refugee camps in South Nepal.
Oh, wow.
So on both sides, we were very cognizant of the fact that Hindus are fleeing different types of persecution, and they need to be integrated into India because they have nowhere else to go. India is their only refuge. So CAA came along that path, and so we had to support CAA. Now, we thought that the language should have been different to be more inclusive. It didn't have to specifically said persecuted minorities, and we've communicated that to the government.
Right.
We hope certain changes can be made. So these types of things, in a way, events in India are getting ahead of us, and so that's put a lot of pressure on HAF when HAF should be focused on one thing. The other thing that Suhag didn't mention, but I would, is that they have faced newer and new organizations who are sort of, taking a page out of the HAF advocacy playbook and trying to turn it against HAF's work. So when HAF grows, when you become a big player, you're suddenly a big target. And she's been, HAF has been dealing with that on a constant basis, which is unfortunate. It's, it's our community. It's, there's even, Hindu groups that supposedly are, Hindu groups, but are opposed to HAF's position stances. So,
well, there was the whole holy against Hindutva nonsense as well, right? Like it's impossible to even celebrate a festival without making a political statement.
You see the challenges. You're very well aware of the challenges.
Yeah. I think there's obviously benefits and problems with the situation that's developed in India over the past 5 to 10 years, in the sense that you finally have a community, you finally have a culture that's starting to wake up and maybe starting to speak for itself. That's something that hasn't happened for a good 60 to 70 years. And this is what the world is used to. The world is used to a nice, quiet Hindu who just sits in the store, says, "Thank you, come again." And that's it. That's the end of it, And then the Hindu starts to talk back when you say something to him. And then he's like, well, that's not correct. This is how it is. Well, that's not right. This is how it is. So obviously you're like, first of all, there's a little bit of a shock. It's like, how dare you talk back to me? And then there's like, all right, how can we shut this guy up? Because we don't like him talking now. So there's an aspect to that, certainly. And in India, it's very clear to see that people aren't happy with this outspokenness, this newfound outspokenness that the Hindu community has developed. So I think some of the challenges that the Hindu community is facing in India, and organizations like HAF are facing in the West here in the United States, are very similar in the sense that people are not happy with this voice. They're just upset at where did this voice come from and how can I make it stop? There's an aspect of that. So in that sense, I'm very happy that there's organizations like you here out there, representing this voice. That really does need that sort of representation, because the misinformation surrounding the Hindu community is monumental. And so the effort to deal with it needs to be similar as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, and even just beyond kind of the responsive or reactive necessity, I think the positive fact is that our tradition has a lot to offer to some of the greatest challenges that we're facing as a global community. Climate change, all of these things, income inequality, this global crisis of COVID. There are things in our tradition that inform the way that we approach problems and how we seek to solve them. We have a great comfort with science. And so all of these things should be seen as positive factors and invited. But look, if we're not invited, then we push ourselves onto the table. It's fine, But I do think that it's important for us not to lose sight of dharma in our reactions, but as well as our work. And I do feel that you see that in political leaders who talk about the Gita, or who turn to it for inspiration in terms of, look, there's not always the same answer to every problem. You have to weigh the different circumstances, the different context. And those are the types of nuanced approaches that are going to allow us to get to the best solutions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, again, I'm just happy that there are organizations like yours out there. And I would suggest people that are watching here to go check out the Hindu American Foundation. Go support. I actually had a super chat that I missed and I wanted to bring to your attention. It was Rahul Anjur who said, I'm an Indian American and a contributor to the HAF. So thanks, Suhag. That's what he said. So yeah. So clearly your work is appreciated. I appreciate it. And I would obviously recommend people go check out the Hindu American Foundation. And if you like what they do, please go ahead and support them as well. The links are all provided in the description of this video. So go ahead and check those out. And guys, Aseem and Suhag, again, I really want to thank you for taking the time out from your day today and having a chat with me. This was fun, and I hope we can do this in the future.
Yeah, it was great, Shyam. Thanks for and Suhag and I didn't fight, and we were
good. Look at that.
which is shocking. Shyam, you've got a good calming effect. And I just want to put a plug in for your show that you're putting together such amazing content. So go to Patreon and support Shyam because, as we're talking about media bias, we need more people like Shyam who are willing to kind of dig into the facts and explain stories in a very entertaining way, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Support Shyam.
Thank you.
Definitely.
All right, guys. Thanks very much for watching today's video. Go check out the Hindu American Foundation. Again, all the links are in the description. Check them out. This episode will be available as a podcast later as well. So I'll share those on Twitter. So go ahead and go to Twitter and check those out as well. Once again, Aseem and Suhag, thanks very much for joining me. And we hope we'll do this again soon.
Sounds good. Stay healthy.
Yeah, we'll give you the COVID namaste.
Yeah, COVID namaste.
Stay healthy.
All right, guys, everybody stay healthy. Thanks again for joining me. Subscribe, like, comment, abuse, all the fun stuff. And we'll check you guys next time. Bye-bye.